mortality of bears has raised that number to approximately 50 bears a year, which is a little over 10%, which may be reaching as much as a bear population can sustain. And I say that because with respect to mountain lions, it's been shown convincingly that mountain lion populations can only sustain 12, maybe a 14% hit every year before the population declines. And in Nevada, we have a mountain lion population estimated by the department at approximately 1,500 animals. We regularly kill over that, sometimes well over 200 animals in a year, although the last few years have been lower than that. So with respect to mountain lions, we're also killing at a rate that suggests, that current science suggests, is not sustainable. And with respect to that, there's no indication in the harvest guidelines that other current science is brought to bear on what is being recommended. For example, the importance of the resident male and what happens when resident males are taken directly or inadvertently, and the chaos that that causes with respect to females raising cubs and also for surrounding agricultural interests and whatnot. And there have been a study or two recently that came out from British Columbia where mountain lion human encounters have been higher for some reason than anywhere else in the U.S. And those studies are suggesting that the way in which mountain lion hunting in British Columbia is done, which is randomly, contributes to the lion-human encounters. It does not reduce them. With respect to bobcats, I've given you all, most of you, 35-year trend data. Nevada's own bobcat data showing that we've had a rather dramatic decline in kitten production over the last 35 years, with the last 15 years, that number reaching approximately 53%, or 53 kittens per 100 females. And with respect to the department's guidelines on trapping, the bobcat kittens per 100 females, it's on one of your graphs that you have here. The department is suggesting current mean, the current number that they're going to be looking at is 66 kittens per 100 females, which is approximately a third less than what the biology of the animal suggests is the case. So the department is simply moving the goalposts on this issue and saying that a number that does not look bad, if you look at the 35-year trend data, is now the new norm for Nevada. I think that's bad business. I don't think that bobcats should continue to take the hit that they've taken for the last 35 years. There's other information in the trend data that supports my comment with respect to kittens. And
Dr. Boldy, you're at about 3.5 minutes. Could you wrap it up?
I haven't heard you comment about anybody else going on today, but I'm done, basically. So thank you.
Further public comment?
Oh, okay. For the record, Joe Blakesley, Nevada Trappers Association. I considered not speaking, but since my friend Don got up, I have to. We're okay with what's going on generally as far as the fur bearers. I mean, 66 kittens per 100 females. I mean, how does that compare to what the other animals that we talk about? I mean, I could make an argument that it should be 30, you know? So just think about that for a minute. We're taking a hit on this, and we're going to agree to do that to start with, to see how this goes. I kind of like the ideas of having some standards to look at, and as long as we can review them, that's fine. So all the way off of that part of it, there's one specific thing that I'd like to have changed, and that's in the protocols they want to have the gray fox and the bobcat seasons to go concurrently. There's no reason to do this. We should manage the gray fox as a separate species. The reason this comes about is way back in the 70s when bobcat populations or prices first went up and we went into the tagging and whatnot. there was some concern that people from Utah were going to come over and say they were trapping gray fox and poached bobcats. I mean, that's been 40 some odd years ago. I mean, there's a whole bunch of species that you can trap away before bobcat season. One of them's a kit fox and one of them's a red fox. I would suggest that if you want to manage the species together, why don't you throw the gray fox in with them and start it on October 1st? You can trap raccoons, you can trap marmots, you can trap coyotes, you can trap badgers, you know, all kinds of species. So there's no reason to do this. It's not a law enforcement thing. If somebody's going to go out and try and poach a bobcat, I mean, and say he's trapping a gray fox, why doesn't he just say he's trapping coyotes? That's just as easy. So that just makes no sense. I'd like to ask that the gray fox, if you want to go ahead and set the seasons concurrently with the bobcats each time that we set seasons, you have that power. But to set it in stone, we would like to have that be managed as a separate species. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Any further public comment, Carson City? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for discussion or action. Commissioner Hubbs.
Yes, I did have one more question actually, so I've been wading through this process, but as I was looking through it species by species, I did notice I had down for the mountain lion a concern in terms of the new predation management plan and some of the numbers that have been set or some of the mandates that are required under that plan. How is that data being integrated with the hunt data?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, what the harvest statistics would demonstrate, if for instance in an area we were seeing a population decline, what we would expect to see would be the characteristics within the harvested animals. In other words, a larger proportion of adult females in the harvest. And what typically occurs is as you drive a population down, they're the last animals that tend to become vulnerable. And so if a population were driven down, we would expect to see, within the recreational harvest, we would expect to see a larger proportion of adult females in the harvest. Now, we would have to factor that into an overall perspective. So if we saw that and it was part of an overall harvest, the overall objective for that area was to keep that population stable. What we would do at that point is identify a threshold below that, and we would set the harvest objective at that level. Now, that's just if in an overall picture. When we make the decision, when we make the management decision to reduce a population of lions in an area to benefit another species, that's our objective. Our objective is to exploit that population in that situation, and so we would probably be less likely to recommend a harvest reduction because we've got this targeted removal. Our overall objective is to reduce that population.
So basically you're saying that in areas where the mountain lions are being taken through the predation management plan, you would just similarly you would adjust your hunting in those areas? Because it seems to me like you would just compile it, sort it, and look at what you have, because the data from the predation management along with the harvest could tell you something different. And I don't know if that would be information that would be missed.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, you're absolutely right. We would look at that data in addition to, but what I'm suggesting is if in an area if an area is being overly exploited, Even without that, even without that data, we would expect to see it demonstrated in the harvest. We would detect that change. And so we would then, at that point in time, be able to make a decision in our recommendation. We would look at that. If we detected a decline and our objective was to hold that population stable, the department would respond by making a recommendation for that area, for that genetic population. We would recommend a reduction in the harvest objective there. I say that, but at the same time, if we know that we are reducing that population, if we're getting the response we expect because we're trying to reduce that population, that's our objective, and so we wouldn't change our harvest. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear on that.
I'm just wondering if when you're doing the predation management work, if we're taking in the same type of data that you would be taking in through your harvest, just in case you needed to look at that and make sure that you didn't miss an opportunity to statistically look if one is impacting the other.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, you're absolutely correct. We would collect that data. We would look at that data. What we would expect to see is if we are doing a localized removal, we're probably going to see that response in that localized area much more quickly than what we would on a broader area. And so you're absolutely correct. We would collect the data and we would look at that as well.
Further commission comments, questions? Commissioner Drew.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw one option out here for my other commissioners to consider, but I think we've got our hands full with the big game portion of this. I might be inclined to look at that for potential final approval at the February meeting, given that we'll be looking at seasons anyway, and we'll be able to see how the harvest guidelines interact with seasons. But I'm wondering if it makes sense to table the wild turkey, upland, small game, and fur bear for a future meeting, since we won't be setting those seasons at that time, which will provide everyone, I think, a little relief from the document overload. I still have notes that I haven't gotten to, specifically with elk. In the memo it talks about we don't have harvest criteria for spike and antlerless hunts, but I would argue that we do have population objectives that are defined in the subplans. I think last time I kind of informally asked to insert a table that laid those out, and we didn't get them, so that might be part of a future motion here. But I think we're still struggling a little bit with two things, one being document overload and content, and the other one being process and making sure the cabs clearly understand what's going on. And I think it'll come into focus when they see the harvest objectives up against what's being proposed for seasons. So I'm comfortable there. I just don't want to kind of short shrift some of those other species. So that's one thought I had. And Brian, I don't think there was a question in there, but just kind of thinking out loud.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Drew, if I understood the question, I don't think there would be any jeopardy if we were to deal with just the big game sections of this for February.
Further commissioner comments? Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I shared the same thought from Commissioner Drew. It's there's a lot of information here, and I think that we've heard from some of the folks that have talked. The people are still processing a little bit. I would ask that I received two documents, one with the regular packet, and one as a packet by itself. But I also received an email, all relevant to the harvest management stuff, and each one of them was a little different. And listening to Mr. Allen, his comments, I don't know if that contributed to maybe what you guys are experiencing Humboldt, but I kind of experienced something the same. I'm sitting here kind of comparing notes and trying to sift through these and which ones are alike, which ones aren't, which is the most recent one. And I was able to get rid of a few pieces of paper, but what it ultimately boiled down to was I have stuff here, the same. I have one here that's 3 of 24, and that same sheet of paper is 1 of 102 in another document. And I struggled with that, and I think that if we were to have one one clean document that comes to us from whichever direction. It's the same document, it's just coming from the same source. I think that would be helpful too. I think kind of focus the attention, and that was my experience.
I'm going to come to the department's defense here a little bit on that. I think what's happening is we're getting, at the last meeting, everybody wanted the entire document. And when it came right down to it, I had a conversation with Mr. Wakeling, and that entire document would have been, I don't even remember how many pages it was.
173.
And I told him to kind of go with what the current version is and then make the other available so that if somebody wanted to go look at the entire document, they could, but not send it all out, because that file would have been, they couldn't have even sent it to us really, or put it on the website. And I think at this point, I personally agree with you. I think we just need to have the most current version. And if somebody wants to look back at what it was previously, go back and look at it. But I think we need to start with what we've got here as a current version and work on that at this point, because I agree, it gets overwhelming, because I looked at this, but then, like you say, another document comes FedEx yesterday or something too, so.
And I didn't
know where
mean
you guys
for
are.
my comments to be overly critical. It was just kind of spelling out that I was struggling to sift through some of it. Maybe we created, maybe we were guilty of creating that situation by asking, but nonetheless, if there was some clarity, I think it would help. And so my point was made, but I didn't mean to be critical about it. I know it's a big project.
But Mr. Chairman, Mr. Commissioner McNeach, we did not take it critically. You know, this is, admittedly, there's a lot of information here, and I'm struggling with the best way to try to present. We've discussed, trying to highlight the things that are different, but yet, when I try to do when I leave one commission meeting and move to the next one is to use track changes, so it clearly identifies the changes that occurred from this meeting to the next meeting. I'm a little bit concerned even thinking about trying to highlight all the changes and then use track changes on the next document. It certainly two clearly different ways of identifying different aspects of it, but it can be challenging.
Commissioner Drew.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I think to me, the track changes really aren't that helpful. Maybe others find it helpful. I think when I was talking about highlighting any new approaches in the document, so for instance, we know that our policy for management of pronghorn says an objective of 20 to 30 total bucks, and the guidelines now state that we're going to go to bucks over 2 years of age. If we could highlight that different approach, I think it'd stand out to the county advisory boards as well as the public. I don't think they need to see track changes from every version. So in my opinion, if we posted the most recent version and boil it down to just the big game species, and we highlighted any place where we're taking a different approach to either setting the seasons or the quotas, so it flags it for whoever's reviewing the document, I think that would get us there. But I'm open to input from my fellow commissioners on that one.
Commissioner Young.
I very rarely hate to admit how dumb I am, but this is really complicated stuff to me. I'm not a mathematician, nor am I a scientist, just a dumb cop, but, I think we need to break this down, as you said, into something that more a layperson could understand in a little bit more simplistic terms, or even maybe, I don't know, maybe we need to have a workshop on how to understand all this, because I've been on the commission 5 years now, and I don't recall something this complicated with this many versions handed to me at one time. And it is voluminous. It's a lot. And I'm not being critical either. I want to learn, but there's got to be a better way for me to absorb this than what I got here today, because it's just too much at one time to make a good decision. And do we need all this material? In kind of alluding to what Jeremy and Grant said, but we did ask for it. I know we do ask for a lot. So it's a double-edged sword. It's just that some of us aren't as bright as others, I guess, when it comes to this. And I'm not a wildlife professional. I'm just a guy that likes to hunt and fish, so.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Young, I think this illustrates in a large way the way many of our biologists feel. I listen to the cabs try to struggle with understanding some of the things that we're trying to prepare. But from my perspective, when I watch our biologists struggle with a recommendation and they don't have a clear set of guides on how to formulate it, and they put it forward, and they sometimes watch the cabs kick it around, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. They certainly, that's their role, that's what they're there for, but our biologists lose a little bit of, they feel like they lose a little bit of hide every time they have to try and defend that. And then the commission has been incredibly supportive of the biologists when they come before, to make the recommendation. You guys are always respectful, and I can't tell you how much they appreciate that. But at the same time, it's also frustrating for them when we come back and go, well, yeah, we lost these permits. And what we're trying to do is get an agreed upon process that they're going to use. And that doesn't mean that we're still not going to change tag numbers and quotas. We just want to have a clear direction on how we're going to go forward with that.
And I agree with you, Brian, but I'll use Mike Cox for example. He's a biologist, I believe. Extremely believable to me and very professional. And when he presents something to us in the method and manner that he has in the past, I get it usually. And he uses some pictures and some things, and he's more hands-on approach. I believe we as commissioners are primarily lay people from a variety of different backgrounds. And I doubt some of you would know how to do what I do well, which is a little small piece of the world, but it doesn't take rocket science. It's relying on your credibility and your experience and your background, and I believe that's our job, and make decisions based on common sense and some data that's presented to us. This very clear but understandable to the layperson and the general hunting public, conservationists, people that are interested in a variety of things revolving about this, the wildlife world. This is just, a different way of presenting it. And like I said, we've had some great biologists come in here and present. It's just, I don't know, today, some of these presentations are a little overwhelming lately. And I like the old school approach a little bit more for me, and like I said, they're very believable, your biologists, when they present. And just my opinion.
Commissioner Hubbs.
I was going to say, I'm a big, as an attorney and actually having a science background, I don't mind what you did. I actually like the, when you track your changes for me, but that's my personality. But also in that feature, we do have the notes section, and what might be nice is to put the rationale behind some of the changes so that individuals will understand that it's just not coming out of anywhere, that this is the most latest science speaking, and so we're shifting from this to this, and this is why. So they don't feel that perhaps something's being changed arbitrarily and they don't really understand how that impacts them or their hunt. That might be helpful, or even a quick summary before each animal about substantive changes that may impact hunt if it does. But I think the majority of the cab members may just be nervous that it will impact their recreation and what they're used to and what to expect out in the field. And if they feel perhaps that there's not going to be that much more variation. These are scientific guidelines that will be used internally just to help you do your job. They'll feel more confident in that. And another thing I was going to say is, in terms of the guidelines, when you set your hunts, we do that differently than the guidelines. So you're saying every time you're setting your numbers for your hunt annually, you are looking at that data when you're setting quotas real time, because some of these guidelines will say, we'll look at the data in 3 years. Well, what if that's too late? What if something harmful is happening? But from what I can hear you're saying is, we're looking at it every year.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, we absolutely are looking at it every year. The way I like to look at the guidelines, and again, most of this exists already. I mean, if I was to boil down the mule deer guidelines, what I would say is, if the buck-to-doe ratio is above 30 and it's in a standard management unit, we're going to increase tags. If the buck-to-doe ratio is below 30 and it's a standard management unit, we're going to reduce tags. And if it's at 30 or within a confidence interval of 30, we're going to leave things as it is. And that's essentially what this is trying to say, but we don't feel like we've earned our government salary unless we've used 4 pages to say it. And that's a little bit of an overstatement. But essentially, there's some other things that kind of factor into it, but if I was going to boil it down to one feature, that would be what that feature is. And then looking at season structures, largely to say, can we provide people with enough time to have a reasonable chance to hunt? There's a lot of ways to deal with hunter crowding or the perception of hunter crowding. One of those ways is to have very short hunts with very few numbers of people in them. And Arizona chose to go that direction. And when we asked the people of Nevada whether or not they wanted long hunts that they could choose from, or whether they wanted short hunts with fewer people, they said they wanted long hunts. And so we're trying to provide that season structure because that's what they told us they wanted to have. Some of this information says we're going to use 3-year averages, and the reason we're going to use 3-year averages is we tend to have wildly fluctuating data if we don't look at it from an average standpoint. So we get better data if we look at 3-year averages. But that doesn't mean if we see a wide swing in this year's data that we're not going to make a recommendation that's contrary to the guidelines. But it's something that we're gonna change, and we're gonna make a recommendation contrary to that. This is, in my mind, essentially the recipe that we're going to use. There's a lot of ways to set that recipe. We could say, a bear season will start no earlier than September 1st and end no later than December 31st. And then if we choose a season length that's within that, we're still within the guidelines. What that tells us is that's where the commission would like us to have the season. We're not going to come in with a recommendation to say March 15th we're going to start a bear hunt, or August 1st. We're going to stay within the parameters of those. But we may choose to change that among years. But what that gives us is a framework. We know what last year's season was. We know that was within this framework, and that's what we're going to come forward with as a recommendation. To use bears as an example, the information that we have within the bear plan would have suggested that we would have recommended an increase in tags, possibly an increase in the harvest objective, although I think that's less likely, but certainly an increase in tags based on the criteria within the plan. But we have chosen not to do that because we wanted to have this conversation with the commission to make sure that we're considering specifically some of the things that Commissioner Drew pointed out that we neglected to include in here. I think the commission is going to provide us with that direction to consider those things, and we've got a kind of a more holistic way of looking at how we need to formulate our season sets and our quotas, because while we haven't, it's extremely rare that we're going to, I just absolutely believe there's no time have we brought a recommendation before the commission that would be detrimental to a population. But it's challenging to know what we're shooting for, and this is why we've engaged in this conversation with the commission.
Director Wasley, and before you, with yours, I've just remind us how long we have the room for tonight, since we have 4 items left. All night? All right. Let's go.
We have the room until 7 p.m.
Okay.
I want to provide maybe just some general background information to the genesis of this document. I think that's getting lost a little bit in this discussion. And so if I'm a game division administrator who comes in from another state and people start bringing recommendations to me that I'm going to take forward to a wildlife commission and I'm going to take forward to county advisory boards, and there isn't a consistent rhyme or reason between biologist A and biologist B, or there isn't concurrence with an existing management plan, for example, the elk species management plan, I think it's perfectly logical and needed to implement some consistency, some process, some guidelines, if you will. So there was some internal debate that I'm aware of that some of the biologists didn't see the value in bringing such a document before into this public process right here. Why trouble the commission with that? Why ask the commission? We know what's best. And I know that the Game Division Administrator Wakeling's perspective was we want to be transparent. We want everybody to know the genesis, the basis of these recommendations. We want them to be consistent with these existing management plans. If we are telling ourselves in an elk management plan that we will manage our bull ratios between 15 to 40 bulls per 100 cows, and in reality we're at 80 or 72 or 96, we should have some basis for where that quota ends up. And so I think the genesis, I think the need is clear. And so the question is, and Brian had it in his PowerPoint, that one of the customers was the biologist. There was internal need for this. And the other customer is the public, and it's transparency. So as I listen to the concerns, I hear concerns coming from the commission that are about transparency and the ability to affect change, and in particular questioning the 4-year time frame. I hear questions coming from the non-hunting or anti-hunting community about concern over individual species and decreased populations or the potential for them to become extinct. I hear questions from the county advisory boards, sportsmen, trappers, that they'll lose their flexibility and this is somehow set in stone, as one person said. And I think we need to remember a point that was made 2 or 3 times in the PowerPoint, that these are not binding whatsoever. This is a starting point, not an ending point. And perhaps removal of that 4-year time frame, I have absolutely no desire or intention to preclude the county advisory boards or this commission from providing input and making those adjustments on an annual basis. I think we've heard some really good recommendations. The idea that Lincoln County, Elko County have to put the 3-season structure back, have that option. But because it isn't in the guidelines doesn't mean that option doesn't already exist. And so there's a tremendous amount of fear in the room over what this document is or isn't. I think the need is clear. I don't think anybody can argue that the document isn't somehow needed. The question is everybody assured that opportunity for flexibility and input? Absolutely. Is there a greater need for this to be an internal guidance document than a transparent one that confuses and confounds the discussion? Perhaps, and maybe that's the input that we take back from the commission. This is great. We understand what you're trying to do. Keep it internal. That'll add consistency to the recommendations that are brought forward, and we'll let the public process refine it, tweak it. We see the value in being able to adjust both quotas and seasons. Those are invaluable tools to deal with pressure, depredation issues, crowding issues. That flexibility is invaluable and inherent throughout this process. So this is not intended to be anything that's set in stone, that is not transparent and precludes that flexibility. And I think keeping that in mind might help to address some of those fears that are evident in every stakeholder or faction present in here today.
Further comments from the commission? Commissioner Oaks.
I just wanted to go on record and say that I like that it's transparent. I know it's complex, but I think it's important to put out there what can be used as a guideline at times for the department.
Commissioner Johnston.
I guess I'll go back to something Mr. Wakeling said, and you gave the example of if we're going to manage pronghorn antelope for 20 to 30 adult bucks per 100 post hunting season. If we're above that, we're going to increase tags. If we're going to be below that, we reduce the tags. We said that, but we just took 4 pages to say it. But I think that's the whole thing, is that the guidelines are there. It's when I read through this and like their season structures and all that, I sometimes think, well, let's get to the guideline. Put in the explanation as what that guideline means, and then I think it's for the public and the commission to say back to the department, well, we actually think more units should be, for example, on the deer, and say, well, we actually think more than the 8 or 9 units being suggested should be managed with the $30 to $40 per 100, based upon public feedback of opportunity versus more of a trophy quality type hunt, or vice versa, based upon feedback. So I think we start taking out some of the, I don't understand, because I was reading through it and I was like, the seasons, why are the seasons in here? We're talking about harvest guidelines. And then I get to the one paragraph, I'm like, okay, now I understand what we're focused on. And then I get the explanation, okay, if we're not on this objective, this is what it means to quota setting. And then the public has the opportunity to say, all right, if this is the department's goal on the guidelines, but we want something different. Because you can see how the harvest objective can impact, just the mule deer to me is the easiest example, with the alternate units, the 8 suggested by Lincoln County to add a 9th, as to how these are used in the public process, both in quota setting and fulfilling objectives that, as a policy level, the commission may, in working with the department. So I just wonder maybe if taking some of the season dates out could help, because those are set by the commission. Setting the season prescription, getting into the harvest management and tag quota prescriptions with the explanation that we just heard, and then I think it's a much more readable document. It helps everyone understand what the goal is. And I agree with Director Walsley wholeheartedly. It's needed, because I think the framework that I have now after reading this a few times, in terms of going into quota setting, I understand it so much better. But this didn't previously exist. So I absolutely agree with the use. I'm not trying to criticize the department in any way on what they've put together. I just think if there's some way to simplify it a little bit for public consumption. And I think one of the things that was said, there was multiple customers for this product. That customer base is pretty different when you're thinking biologists versus commissioners and members of the public. And maybe you have to have 2 different products for the different customer bases. But I'm the more I navigate, the more I hear, I understand it so much better. I think what made me confused was all the season dates and everything in this, which I thought, that's not really a harvest guideline. And maybe if we streamlined it like that, I think it would be much more manageable for everyone to get through.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Johnson, one of the reasons we, I think that we can probably do try and take a stab at trying to simplify what we've described within here. I think one of the reasons that we've included season structure is that often tends to be one of the dynamics that our biologists tend to struggle with. We hear concerns about overlap. We hear concerns about hunter crowding. And so what we wanted to try to do is provide the season structure so that the hunting public also knew what those season structures would look like. It may very well be that we can simplify the overall structure such that we can demonstrate what the season looks like and do it in a far more simple fashion as well. But from my perspective, one of the things that we would like to be transparent about is what we intend to do for season structures. If the commission chooses to go away from that, I certainly, I'm not going to lose any sleep tonight.
Anything further from the commission? Commissioner Drew?
Yeah, I would just say I echo what Director Wasley stated. I mean, I've supported putting these management guidelines, or harvest guidelines together from the beginning. I think the complexity of it is, A, we're taking on a whole new process, B, there's so much to digest, and C, one of the reasons I was so big on harvest guidelines is for the benefit of this commission and the public and the county advisory boards, because when we got recommendations in the past, we didn't always know what was driving them. Now that we're learning what drives them, we're learning that it's a pretty complex process. And I think just that realization in itself is a good thing. I would also state, and it's something I think, Brian, you alluded to earlier, but the department and the commission need to do a little bit better job on some of these individual species or combined species management plans, because in the 5.5 years that I've been on this commission, I think we looked at one plan one time and it was more or less provided to us to look at and not provide input on. And so I think looking forward, that's something we need to address. I think the guidelines kind of set the framework that, hey, we're admitting we have a problem, we need to look at these, if nothing else, to be familiar with them. So, I mean, we have commissioners up here who have never really been presented a species management plan that a lot of this is based on. And so I'm supportive of moving the process forward. I don't know if we need kind of a formal motion to work through this or not, but Brian, I don't know what you're looking for at this point based on all the discussion we've had, but I could attempt a motion if we want one.
Do you think a motion would help you at this point?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, a motion is going to formalize what you would like to see us incorporate, delete, and I personally would find it very helpful.
Commissioner Drew.
Okay, so I'm going to take a stab at this with the intent that my other commissioners will add some friendly amendments if needed. So,
Chairman, Commissioner Drew, I don't know if it would be any easier, but you may want to approach this as you might a quota setting and possibly just take it a species at a time. Just a suggestion.
we could attempt that. So I guess my first motion would be to table those portions of the harvest guidelines pertinent to wild turkey, upland and small game and fur bearer for a future meeting, and advance that portion of the harvest guidelines specific to big game for consideration at our next meeting.
I'll second that motion.
I have a motion by Commissioner Drew and a second by Commissioner Johnston. Everyone understand the motion? Call for the question. All in favor, say aye. 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 Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously.
Okay, and then maybe to speak to what we want to see as some of the support material. I make a motion that the department provide the most current document with changes and post as support material for the next meeting, in specific to highlight any new approaches that may be in the document not outlined by other plans or previous practices.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second the motion.
I have a motion by Commissioner Drew and a second by Commissioner McNinch. Everyone understand the motion?
So essentially, in a nutshell, what we're going to do is for support material, we're going to have the most current document with any of the inputs from today and the county advisory board inputs included. And any new approaches that we have that aren't in one of the existing plans or that we haven't been following in the past would be highlighted. So when a public or a county picks up the document and we're proposing something new, and I think the example I gave was on the antelope, they know that's a new approach. So at least they kind of know this isn't what we've done the last 10 or 20 years. This is something we're looking at that would be new. Does that make sense, Brian?
I understand that.
Okay.
Commissioner Johnston.
So you're envisioning the department creates a new draft of this document based upon what they've heard today?
Yeah, it would be an updated draft. anticipate them necessarily making it from scratch, but.
No, I understand that.
Right, and like, we don't need the draft that we had in the support material today, just give us one draft that we're working from, the most recent version. Yep.
I guess I'd like to see, one of the things I'd like to see is, in that revised draft that's going to be looked at, is the follow-up explanation that we heard today, so that when we look at various harvest management and tag quota prescriptions for each species, there's the explanation like we got today, that if the post-harvest buck-to-doe ratio is above this, it results in this. If it's below this, it results in this. And that type of explanation to give everyone the framework as to what those guidelines then mean. Does that make sense?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Johnston, what I would envision, if this motion were to pass, is that I would take the big game section forward, highlight the changes that are substantive from differences, as Commissioner Drew pointed out. And what I would also envision is in the cover memo that would go with the document, I would elucidate, basically, boil it down to the simplest. This is what it means, and try and keep it that simple in the cover memo and have the accompanying document.
Does everyone understand the motion?
Yeah, and let me just add to that, just something to keep in mind. We are going to have, at the next meeting, all the big game quotas will be recommended, believe it or not, seasons. So what we'll be able to see is the seasons that were set last year, the proposed seasons from this year, with the understanding that the proposed seasons this year are based on the harvest guidelines. So it'll actually be two sets, in essence, two sets of support material.
Anyone have any further discussion? Have a motion on the table. I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously. Commissioner Drew.
Okay, one more, and this would be more, I think, species specific, but this is the list I had. So I would move to add a biological framework specific for black bear and mountain lion, to revise the black bear section for consistency with the committee recommendations, at least items 1 through 3, and add a table of all elk subplans and population objectives contained in those subplans.
Second. I have a motion by Commissioner Drew with a second by Commissioner McNinch. Does everyone understand the motion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously.
That's all I had on my notes, but certainly I could have missed something, so.
Commissioner Johnston.
When I read through this, on the mule deer, there was the explanation of the standard hunt and the management guidelines for standard hunts, and then the same for alternative hunts in specific units. And then there was a chart for non-standard hunts with 2 management strategies, A and B. And I couldn't find in here the explanation as to the management strategies A and B for those non-standard hunts. So I would move that in the next draft we see an explanation for that.
Second.
I have a motion by Vice Chairman Johnston and a second by Commissioner Drew. Is everyone clear with the motion? Call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously. Does that wrap up everyone's concerns on this agenda item? Okay, we'll close agenda item number 12.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Just for clarification, if there are any changes to the document other than what we've talked about here, Did the commission want to retain any track changes? What I'll do is accept all the changes at this point, but I just want clarification on what the commission would like to have for anything that might change, like if we add an explanation of the strategies.
In my opinion, I think if we came forth with just what we've done with the motions, I think it's going to be much, if you start, it's going to get piled deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's what's the rest of the commission feel on that?
Yeah, my preference is for a clean document, but
Yeah, that's mine as well.
Very good. We'll ensure that there's no track changes.
All right, thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you.